The early morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Henderson's front yard as he slowly made his way down the worn concrete path to collect his newspaper. At 93 years old, his steps were careful but determined, each movement carrying the weight of nearly a century of experiences. The small town of Mill Creek was just beginning to wake up, and a familiar smell of fresh bread from Wilson's bakery down the street filled the crisp morning air. Frank had lived in this modest white house with blue shutters for over 60 years. He bought it in 1963 after returning from the war, back when the streets were still unpaved and most of his neighbors had victory gardens in their backyards. Now, his home stood as one of the last original houses on Oak and Main, a quiet reminder of how things used to be in their rapidly changing town. Every morning followed the same peaceful routine. Frank would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as he had done during his military days. He put on his worn but carefully pressed khaki pants, a clean white shirt, and his comfortable brown leather shoes that his daughter Sarah had given him last Christmas. His breakfast was always the same: 2 pieces of toast with butter, a soft-boiled egg, and a cup of black coffee. The highlight of Frank's day was tending to his rose garden. Over the decades, he had cultivated what many considered to be the finest rose collection in Mill Creek. 37 different varieties bloomed in his front yard, each with its own story. The bright red American Beauty roses came from cuttings his late wife Martha had planted in 1965. The yellow peace roses were gifts from grateful neighbors after he helped organize the town's first community watch program in the 1970s. People often stopped to admire his roses, and Frank took great pride in sharing their stories. He kept a small notebook where he recorded every detail about his plants: when they were planted, their blooming patterns, and the special care each variety needed. His methodical approach to gardening reflected his military background, where attention to detail had often meant the difference between life and death. Inside his home, Frank kept his war medals in a simple wooden display case that hung in his living room. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and several other commendations told the story of his service in World War II. But Frank rarely talked about those days. Instead, he preferred to focus on his community and the peaceful life he built after returning home. The neighbors had come to see Frank as the unofficial guardian of their street. From his front porch, where he spent most afternoons in his favorite rocking chair, he kept a watchful eye on the neighborhood. He knew every family, every pet, and every car that belonged on their street. Children would wave to him as they passed by on their bikes, and busy parents would often stop for a quick chat, knowing Frank always had a kind word or bit of wisdom to share. Mrs. Thompson from next door brought him homemade soup every Sunday, and young Tommy Parker, a high school student from across the street, helped Frank with his heavier yard work. In return, Frank taught Tommy about gardening and shared stories about what their town was like in the old days. It was a simple exchange that represented everything Frank loved about their tight-knit community. As Frank settled into his porch chair that particular morning, newspaper in hand and coffee cup on the small table beside him, he had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to be disrupted. The sound of distant motorcycles rumbled somewhere beyond their neighborhood, an unusual noise in their quiet town. Frank adjusted his reading glasses and opened his newspaper, unaware that the peaceful life he had built was about to face its biggest challenge since his wartime days. The morning light caught the silver in his hair as he turned the pages, his weathered hands steady and sure. In the garden, his roses swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the sunlight like jewels. It was just another quiet morning in Mill Creek, but it would be one of the last peaceful ones Frank would know for quite some time. The peace of Mill Creek began to crumble on a Tuesday afternoon when the old Peterson warehouse, just 2 blocks from Frank's house, got new owners. A group called the Steel Ravens Motorcycle Club had bought the building at a surprisingly low price. Within days, the quiet neighborhood changed completely. Frank first noticed the changes while tending to his morning roses. The sound of heavy motorcycles echoed through the streets, their loud engines drowning out the usual chirping of birds and friendly greetings of passing neighbors. Black and chrome motorcycles lined the streets, often parked wherever their riders pleased, including across driveways and on carefully maintained lawns. The Steel Ravens weren't just any motorcycle club. Their leather jackets displayed a fierce-looking black bird with red eyes, and their presence seemed to cast a shadow over the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Thompson, who had brought Frank soup every Sunday for the past 15 years, started making excuses to stay inside. Young Tommy Parker no longer rode his bike to school, asking his mother to drive him instead. One particular morning, Frank watched from his porch as three club members intimidated old Mr. Jenkins, who was walking his small dog. They revved their engines repeatedly, laughing as the scared dog pulled at its leash and Mr. Jenkins struggled to control it. The old man had to pick up his pet and hurry home while the bikers high-fived each other. The local police seemed reluctant to get involved. When concerned residents called about noise complaints or parking violations, the officers would drive by slowly but rarely stopped. Frank later learned that the Steel Ravens had chapters in several cities, and they had a reputation that made even law enforcement think twice before confronting them. The situation got worse when the club started hosting what they called weekend rallies. Hundreds of motorcycles would roar into town, their riders camping out in the warehouse parking lot. The noise would continue all night, with loud music and the constant rumble of engines making sleep impossible for nearby residents. Empty beer cans and trash littered the streets by morning. Frank noticed how his neighbors began to change their daily routines. Parents stopped letting their children play outside. The evening walks that many residents enjoyed became rare. Even the weekly community bridge club that met at the local library decided to suspend their meetings indefinitely. The neighborhood that Frank had protected during his military service and nurtured for 60 years was becoming unrecognizable. The worst part for Frank was watching the fear grow in his neighbors' eyes. He saw how Mrs. Thompson would peek through her curtains before quickly stepping out to get her mail. He noticed how the local teenagers, who used to gather at the corner ice cream shop, now hurried home directly after school. The community spirit that had made Mill Creek special was dying, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the roar of motorcycles. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch, he overheard a conversation between two club members who had parked their bikes nearby. They were laughing about how easy it had been to take over the neighborhood. "These old folks are too scared to do anything," one said, loud enough for Frank to hear. "It's like having our own private town." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He stood by his window, watching the street lights cast shadows on his beloved roses. The metals in his display case seemed to shine in the darkness, reminding him of another time when he had faced intimidation and fear. As a young soldier in World War II, he had learned that evil triumphs when good people do nothing. The next morning, Frank noticed 3 motorcycles parked across his driveway. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but something felt different today. As he looked at those bikes blocking his path, Frank Henderson made a decision. He might be 93 years old, but he had fought bigger bullies than these. It was time to show the Steel Ravens that they had picked the wrong neighborhood and the wrong veteran to intimidate. Frank Henderson stood at his front door, his old military watch showing 8:15 a.m. The 3 motorcycles were still blocking his driveway, their chrome surfaces gleaming in the morning sun. He had an important doctor's appointment at 9:30, and he knew it was time to act. Straightening his back just as he had done countless times during his military days, Frank walked steadily toward the Steel Ravens warehouse. The closer he got to the building, the louder the music became. Empty beer bottles littered the sidewalk, and the smell of cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air. 4 men sat on beaten-up lawn chairs outside the warehouse entrance, playing cards on an overturned crate. They all wore the black leather jackets with the red-eyed raven on the back. "Excuse me," Frank said, his voice clear and firm despite his age. "There are 3 motorcycles blocking my driveway. I need them moved." The card game stopped. The biggest man, whose jacket had the name Spike stitched on it, looked up slowly. "Well, look what we got here, boys," Spike said, standing up to his full height of 6 feet 4 inches. "It's Grandpa coming to tell us where to park." The other men laughed, but Frank didn't move. His blue eyes, which had once watched for enemy movements across European battlefields, stayed steady and calm. "I have a doctor's appointment," Frank continued, his tone remaining polite but firm. "Moving those bikes would only take a minute of your time." He noticed how the younger men looked to Spike, waiting for his reaction. Frank had seen this kind of behavior before, in the schoolyard, in the army, and now here. There was always a leader who set the tone. Spike walked up to Frank, towering over him. "You know what, old-timer? Those bikes belong to Snake, Razor, and me, and we like them right where they are." He blew cigarette smoke directly into Frank's face. "Maybe you should cancel that appointment. Wouldn't want you hurting yourself trying to squeeze past our rides." Frank didn't flinch at the smoke or the threat. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Opening it carefully, he removed an old, creased photograph. "Let me show you something," he said, holding up the photo for Spike to see. It showed a much younger Frank standing with his army unit in front of a destroyed German bunker. "That's me and my squad after taking Hill 314 in France," Frank explained calmly. "The Germans have been using that position to rain hell on our boys for weeks. We lost good men taking that hill, but we didn't back down then, and I won't back down now." Spike's face reddened. "Are you threatening us, old man?" he growled, stepping even closer. "No," Frank replied, putting the photo away. "I'm just letting you know who you're dealing with. I faced real devils in my time, son, men who believed they could bully and intimidate others into submission. They were wrong then, and you're wrong now." The other bikers had stood up by this time, forming a half circle around Frank, but something in his steady gaze made them keep their distance. This wasn't going according to their usual routine of intimidation. "You got a lot of nerve, Gramps," Spike said, his voice low and dangerous. "But this ain't 1944, and we ain't some Nazi soldiers. You're just a tired old man who doesn't know when to mind his own business." Frank smiled slightly. "You're right about one thing. This isn't 1944. Back then, I only had to worry about enemy soldiers. These days, I have to watch out for my whole neighborhood. Those bikes will be moved, one way or another. It's your choice how we handle this." With that, Frank turned and walked away, his back straight and his steps steady. Behind him, he could hear Spike and his friends laughing and shouting mock threats. But he also heard something else: uncertainty in their voices. For the first time, someone had stood up to them, and that someone was a 93-year-old veteran who showed no fear. The bikes were still in his driveway when Frank reached his house. He hadn't expected them to move them, not yet, but he had taken the first step in what he knew would be a longer battle. As he went inside to make a phone call to his grandson, the lawyer, Frank smiled. The Steel Ravens had just made their first big mistake. They had underestimated an old soldier who still knew how to fight. The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Frank Henderson heard the sound of breaking wood and cruel laughter outside his house. He moved quietly to his window, his old soldier's instincts telling him something was wrong. What he saw made his heart stop for a moment. 3 Steel Ravens members were deliberately destroying his rose garden. Spike, their leader, was ripping up the American Beauty roses that Martha had planted decades ago. Another biker was crushing the yellow peace roses under his heavy boots, while a third kicked over the white trellises Frank had built by hand. Empty beer bottles littered the garden path, and spray paint marked crude symbols on his white picket fence. For the first time since the bikers arrived, Frank felt his hands shake. These weren't just flowers they were destroying. They were memories. Each rose bush held a story. The red ones from his late wife Martha, the pink ones planted when his first grandchild was born, the white ones that marked their 50th wedding anniversary. 60 years of carefully tended memories were being destroyed in mere minutes. Through his window, Frank could hear Spike's words clearly. "Let's see how tough the old man feels now. Maybe next time he'll learn to keep his mouth shut and his camera put away." They had discovered his documentation efforts, and this was their response: a direct attack on what they knew would hurt him most. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her window next door, called the police immediately. But Frank knew that by the time they arrived, the damage would be done. He watched as the bikers finished their destruction, high-fiving each other before roaring away on their motorcycles, leaving behind a scene of devastation. When the sun finally rose, the full extent of the damage became clear. Almost every rose bush had been uprooted or broken. The garden paths were littered with debris, and motor oil had been poured over sections of his lawn. The special bench where he and Martha used to sit had been smashed to pieces. Decades of careful cultivation had been destroyed in one cruel night. Neighbors gathered at their windows and doors, watching as Frank slowly walked through what remained of his garden. He knelt carefully, picking up a broken stem from Martha's American Beauty rose. Tommy Parker rushed over from across the street, close to tears when he saw the destruction. "Mr. Henderson," the boy said, his voice shaking, "I'm so sorry. We should have done something to stop them." But Frank's face showed no signs of defeat. Instead, there was a determination in his eyes that Tommy had never seen before. The old veteran stood up straight, still holding the broken rose stem. "No, Tommy," he said quietly, "this is exactly what we needed them to do." Frank's grandson Michael arrived within an hour, having driven through the night after Frank called him. As a lawyer, he had been building a case against the Steel Ravens, but had struggled to get local authorities to take action. Now, standing in the destroyed garden, taking pictures of the vandalism, he understood his grandfather's calm demeanor. "They made a mistake, didn't they, Grandpa?" Michael asked, understanding dawning on his face. Frank nodded, his expression grim but determined. "In the war, we learned that the enemy is most vulnerable right after they think they've won a victory. They get careless, overconfident. These boys just did exactly what we needed. They crossed a line that no one can ignore." Inside his house, Frank opened the detailed notebook he'd been keeping. Every incident, every photo, every piece of evidence he gathered suddenly had new weight. The destruction of his garden wasn't just vandalism. It was retaliation for his documentation efforts, and that made it a much more serious crime. As Frank sat at his kitchen table with Michael, they began planning their next moves. Mrs. Thompson brought over coffee and her fresh-baked muffins, and Tommy Parker arrived with his laptop to help organize the new evidence. The destroyed garden had become a rallying point, not just for Frank, but for the entire neighborhood. "You know what this means, don't you?" Michael asked his grandfather, looking through the extensive evidence they had collected. Frank's eyes hardened with resolve. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady and sure. "It means the real fight is about to begin." After the confrontation with Spike and his gang, Frank Henderson sat in his study, surrounded by old military maps and photographs. His grandson, Michael, a successful lawyer in the city, had listened carefully to his story over the phone and was now on his way to Mill Creek. But Frank wasn't going to wait idly. Years of military training had taught him that preparation was key to any successful mission. From his desk drawer, Frank pulled out a fresh notebook, just like the ones he used to track his roses. But this one would serve a different purpose. On the first page, he wrote Operation Community Shield in his neat, precise handwriting. Below it, he started making detailed notes about the Steel Ravens, their routines, numbers, and patterns of behavior. Through his window, Frank could see 3 new motorcycles had replaced the previous ones in his driveway. The bikers were playing their usual game of intimidation, but they didn't realize they were dealing with someone who had learned strategy from the best military minds of World War II. Frank reached for his digital camera, a birthday gift from his daughter that he had barely used. Now it would become one of his most important tools. Quietly and methodically, Frank began documenting everything. He photographed the motorcycles blocking driveways, the bikers harassing neighbors, and the growing piles of trash they left behind. He noted times, dates, and license plate numbers in his notebook. His hands, though weathered with age, remained steady as he worked. The same patience that helped him survive long nights in combat now served him well as he built his case. Mrs. Thompson watched in surprise from her window as Frank walked the neighborhood, taking pictures and making notes. When she brought him his Sunday soup, she found him creating detailed maps of the area, marking where the bikers usually gathered and the routes they took through the streets. "Frank," she asked nervously, "aren't you afraid they'll catch you?" Frank looked up from his work and smiled. "Martha," he said, using her first name as old friends do, "in 1944, I spent 3 days behind enemy lines in France, gathering intelligence for our unit. Those young men out there may think they're tough, but they've never faced real danger. They don't know how to look for someone who knows how to watch without being seen." Word spread quietly through the neighborhood about Frank's activities. Tommy Parker, the high school student who helped with Frank's yard work, became his unofficial assistant. The boy's knowledge of computers proved invaluable as he helped Frank organize the digital photos and create spreadsheets tracking incidents. Together, they built a comprehensive record of the Steel Ravens' activities. One evening, while reviewing their work, Tommy asked Frank how he stayed so calm in the face of such intimidation. Frank walked to his display case and carefully removed one of his purple hearts. "You see this, son?" he said, holding the medal. "I got this on D-Day. Our landing craft hit a mine about 100 yards from Omaha Beach. Half my unit didn't make it to shore. But those of us who did had to keep moving forward, had to keep thinking clearly despite our fear." Frank placed the medal in Tommy's hands. "The secret isn't not being afraid," he continued. "The secret is not letting fear stop you from doing what needs to be done. Those boys on their motorcycles, they think making noise and acting tough makes them strong. But real strength? Real strength is staying focused and strategic when others are losing their heads. As darkness fell outside, the sound of motorcycles echoed through the streets once again. But this time, it didn't feel as threatening to Frank. Every rev of their engines, every late-night gathering, every act of intimidation was now being carefully documented. The Steel Ravens thought they were displaying their power, but they were actually helping Frank build a case against them. In his military days, Frank had learned that victory often went to the side that gathered the best intelligence and planned the most carefully. As he added another page of notes to his growing file, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The bikers might have the advantage of youth and numbers, but Frank had something far more valuable: experience, patience, and a lifetime of strategic thinking. The day after his garden's destruction, Frank Henderson transformed his living room into what he called the command center. His military training had taught him that every successful operation needed a proper headquarters. The old coffee table was now covered with maps of the neighborhood, and his walls displayed photos of known Steel Ravens members and their motorcycles. Michael, his grandson, had taken emergency leave from his law firm to help. He sat at Frank's desk, surrounded by legal papers and police reports. "The destruction of your garden changes everything, Grandpa," he explained. "It's clear retaliation for documenting their activities. That makes it a federal offense, intimidating a witness." But Frank wasn't just relying on legal action. He remembered how his old commanding officer used to say that the best strategy uses every available resource. That morning, he had called a secret meeting in his basement, inviting key neighbors he knew he could trust. Mrs. Thompson brought her famous coffee cake, Mr. Jenkins from down the street came with his son who worked in it, and Tommy Parker arrived with 3 of his tech-savvy friends from high school. "In the war," Frank began, standing before his gathered neighbors, "we learned that information and coordination were as important as any weapon. The Steel Ravens think they're strong because they act as one group. Well, we can do the same thing, but better." His voice was steady and confident, reminding some of the older neighbors of how he used to lead town council meetings years ago. Frank's plan was simple but clever. He divided the neighborhood into sectors, just like he had done during military operations. Each sector would have a coordinator who would organize surveillance and reporting. Mr. Jenkins's son helped set up a private online group where neighbors could instantly share information about biker activities. Tommy and his friends created a simple app that could quickly record and upload photos, videos, and location data. Remember, Frank instructed, "We're not confronting them directly. We're gathering evidence and watching their movements. Every illegal action, every threat, every violation gets recorded and reported." He showed them how to use the new apps and explained the importance of detailed documentation. Mrs. Thompson, who had been too scared to leave her house alone, now had a purpose. She would coordinate the afternoon watch schedule from her window that overlooked the main street. Mr. Jenkins, with his small dog, would walk at specific times, noting which bikers were present and what they were doing. Even the local mail carrier agreed to help, noting unusual activities during his daily rounds. Frank also reached out to other neighborhoods where the Steel Ravens had caused trouble. His grandson set up meetings with community leaders from nearby towns, and soon a network of information sharing began to grow. The bikers, who were used to isolating and intimidating individual communities, didn't realize that their victims were now working together. One of Frank's smartest moves was involving the local media. Through Michael's connections, a respected local reporter began investigating the Steel Ravens' activities. The story of a 93-year-old veteran standing up to neighborhood bullies caught people's attention. When photos of Frank's destroyed garden appeared in the newspaper, support began pouring in from across the state. But perhaps the most important part of Frank's strategy was boosting the community's spirit. He organized regular meetings where neighbors could share information and support each other. The fear that had kept people isolated in their homes began to fade as they worked together. Children who had been kept inside were now able to play in their yards again, protected by a network of watchful neighbors. "The Steel Ravens think they broke our spirit when they destroyed my garden," Frank told his growing group of volunteers. "But they don't understand what real strength is. It's not about making noise or causing fear. It's about standing together, supporting each other, and refusing to let bullies win." By the end of the week, Frank's network was fully operational. Hidden cameras had been installed at strategic points throughout the neighborhood. Every incident was being recorded, every illegal action documented. The police, impressed by the organized flow of evidence, began increasing their patrols. As Frank stood on his porch that evening, watching Tommy Parker and his friends install another security camera, he smiled. The Steel Ravens thought they had won by destroying his garden. They didn't realize they had actually helped create something much stronger. A united community ready to take back their streets. 2 weeks after Frank Henderson set up his neighborhood watch system, the first big break came early on a Tuesday morning. Tommy Parker's hidden camera caught 3 Steel Ravens members selling drugs behind the warehouse. The footage was crystal clear, showing faces, license plates, and the illegal activity. Within an hour, Frank had the evidence in the hands of both his grandson Michael and the local police. But that was just the beginning. Frank's organized network was now producing results faster than even he had expected. Mrs. Thompson's afternoon watch spotted the bikers threatening a local business owner who refused to pay them protection money. Mr. Jenkins recorded several members breaking into parked cars along Oak Street. Each piece of evidence was carefully documented and added to Michael's growing legal file. The Steel Ravens, used to operating without consequences, didn't realize they were being watched so carefully. Spike, their leader, continued to strut around the neighborhood, thinking his gang's reputation would keep people scared and silent. But every time he made a threat or broke a law, multiple cameras and witnesses recorded it. One particular incident proved especially important. Frank's surveillance network captured Spike and his lieutenants having a loud conversation outside the warehouse. They were bragging about destroying Frank's garden and planning something even worse for the nosy old man. But this time, their words were caught on high-quality audio, providing clear evidence that the garden's destruction was deliberate retaliation. "This is exactly what we needed," Michael explained to Frank, reviewing the recordings in the command center. They admitted to vandalism and witness intimidation on camera. Plus, we now have proof they're planning more attacks. That's enough for serious legal action. The local police chief, who had been hesitant to challenge the Steel Ravens before, couldn't ignore the mountain of evidence anymore, especially after the state police showed interest in the case. Frank's organized documentation had revealed that the Steel Ravens weren't just neighborhood bullies. They were running a criminal operation that spread across several counties. Frank watched from his porch as the first police raid happened. Squad cars surrounded the warehouse while officers with search warrants went inside. The look of shock on the bikers' faces made him think of another time, long ago in France, when he had helped surprise a group of enemies who thought they were untouchable. The raid uncovered more than anyone expected. Besides drugs and stolen property, the police found evidence linking the Steel Ravens to crimes in 3 different states. Spike and several other leaders were arrested on multiple charges. The sight of the tough biker boss being led away in handcuffs brought neighbors out of their houses, watching in amazed silence. But Frank knew the job wasn't finished. Just like in the war, one victory didn't end the battle. He kept his surveillance network active, watching for any remaining gang members who might try to cause trouble. His military training had taught him to never let down his guard until the mission was truly complete. The local news stations arrived to cover the story. They were fascinated by how a 93-year-old veteran had outsmarted a criminal motorcycle gang. Reporters interviewed Frank on his porch, where he sat in his usual spot, looking calm and composed despite all the excitement. "How did you know your plan would work?" one reporter asked him. Frank smiled, thinking of his days in the service. "In the military, we learned that no enemy is unbeatable if you use the right strategy." These boys thought they were tough because they could scare people, but they forgot that real strength isn't about making threats, it's about standing together and doing what's right. As evening fell, Frank's living room filled with neighbors bringing food and thanks. Mrs. Thompson served her coffee cake, Tommy Parker showed younger kids how the surveillance system worked, and Michael explained to everyone what would happen next with the legal cases. Looking around at his united community, Frank felt the same pride he had experienced during the war. Once again, he had helped good people stand up against bullies. The Steel Ravens had thought they were invincible, but they had never faced an opponent like Frank Henderson, a 93-year-old veteran who knew that the greatest victory comes not from fighting alone, but from bringing people together to stand for what's right. 6 months after the police raid on the Steel Ravens warehouse, Mill Creek had transformed back into the peaceful community Frank Henderson had always loved, but with some important changes. The old warehouse, once a symbol of fear, was being renovated into a community center. The same walls that had once displayed the Steel Ravens logo now showed a beautiful mural of Frank's famous rose garden. On a bright spring morning, Frank stood in his front yard, carefully planting new rose bushes. His garden, once destroyed by the bikers, was coming back to life even more beautiful than before. People from all over town had donated roses, and each new plant came with a story. The mayor had given him rare American beauty roses to replace the ones Martha had planted. Mrs. Thompson contributed yellow peace roses, just like the ones that had been crushed under biker boots. Tommy Parker and his friends had created something special too. Using their tech skills, they set up a small weather station and camera system in the garden. Now, anyone in town could check on the roses through a website they called Frank's Garden Watch. The same surveillance network that had helped defeat the Steel Ravens was now being used to share the beauty of growing things. The story of Frank's stand against the bikers had spread far beyond Mill Creek. Other communities facing similar problems reached out for advice. Michael, Frank's grandson, had even started a nonprofit organization that helped neighborhoods set up their own community watch programs. They called it the Henderson Method, using organization, technology, and community spirit to stand up against intimidation. Spike and most of the Steel Ravens leaders were now serving long prison sentences. The evidence Frank's network had gathered had led to the breaking up of criminal biker operations in 3 states. The FBI agent in charge of the case had personally visited Frank to thank him, saying that one old veteran had accomplished what law enforcement had been trying to do for years. But the biggest changes were in the neighborhood itself. The community that had come together to fight the bikers stayed united. The new community center hosted weekly meetings where neighbors planned events, shared concerns, and worked together to keep their streets safe. Children played freely again, and the evening walks that people had once enjoyed returned. But now with neighbors walking in friendly groups, chatting and looking out for each other. Frank's front porch became an unofficial gathering place. Every afternoon, people would stop by to share news, seek advice, or just enjoy the view of his recovering garden. Young parents brought their children to hear Frank's stories, not just about the war or standing up to the bikers, but about what it means to be part of a community that cares for its own. One special addition to the garden touched Frank deeply. The neighborhood had pooled their money to commission a small bronze plaque, which they placed on a stone near his favorite roses. It read, "Frank Henderson's Garden of Courage," where a 93-year-old veteran taught us that real strength grows from standing together. The local schools even added a new program to their curriculum. Once a month, Frank would visit classrooms to talk about citizenship and community. He would bring photos from his military days and tell students how the lessons he learned in war helped him protect his neighborhood. The children especially loved his message that true courage isn't about being the strongest or toughest, but about doing what's right even when you're scared. On Frank's 94th birthday, the whole town gathered in his garden for a celebration. Mrs. Thompson baked a huge cake. Tommy Parker and his friends set up a screen showing photos from their victory over the Steel Ravens, and everyone brought roses to add to the garden. As Frank looked around at the happy faces of his neighbors, he felt the same pride he had experienced on battlefields long ago. "You see," he told his great-granddaughter as she helped him tend to a new rose bush, "sometimes the most important victories aren't won with weapons, but with wisdom, and the strongest communities aren't built with walls, but with people who care enough to stand together." The sweet scent of roses filled the air as the sun set on Mill Creek, and children played safely in the streets that Frank had helped reclaim. His garden had become more than just a collection of beautiful flowers. It was a living reminder that one person's courage, combined with the community's unity, could overcome any challenge. And in the years to come, whenever anyone asked about the bronze plaque or the story behind it, the people of Mill Creek would proudly tell them about the 93-year-old veteran who taught them the true meaning of strength.